What's up YouTube? I'm the Nice One, and today we are finishing up that Phoenix King Aenarion character model we did last week. This time we're doing the body and the armor, and we're going to be attaching it to the head, and after that I think we're going to be doing the sword, and finally moving on to some texture painting, so that's exciting. I'll leave the STL files down below if that's all you're looking for. But leave any comments if you have any questions on how I created this character or any advice on how I can improve, and let's get started. Okay, let's get started here. So what you see me doing right now is obviously labeling my models, but right now I'm making the base. And that's really important for me to do because I want to make sure that every piece of armor and body part I make after that is proportional. And so after I have the base done, what you see me doing next is I'm just going to be making a reference body. So I'm just going to take a cube, put a couple of edge loops through it using Control R, and then applying a mirror modifier function on it so that I only have to do one half of the side. And yeah, I'm just making a very basic body shape, right? I make a little kind of bean-shaped torso because I want that kind of like chibi character style look, kind of cutesy, disproportionate style. And so I want to make sure that my reference body is proportional to that, right? The head is quite large, but I believe when you do chibi style, the arms and legs are also sort of characteristically big versus the actual body itself. Now what you see me doing is making a little reference for height. I knew that I wanted this character model, once it was like a miniature, to be about like 57 millimeters tall, I believe. I can't remember exactly. But I basically make a cube that is going to act as my height reference going forward. And I make sure to add it on a separate collection so that it's easy to remove later. Once that's done, I'm just finishing up the rest of the body. The main portions of a reference body that I make are basically the head, the upper torso, the lower torso, the upper thigh, the lower leg, so like your calf down to your foot, and then your bicep, your forearm, and then your hands and your foot. So I think it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 pieces all in all. And I make sure to make all of my clothing and armor fit around those 9 pieces because I take into account where the joints are on a body when I'm thinking about animating and rigging. Now that the reference body is done, what I'm moving on to doing next is actually making the armor. So I'm just jumping straight here into doing the chest plate. And the way I'm doing that is I'm taking a flat plane and I'm applying a mirror modifier, and then I'm adding a couple of edge loops so that I have multiple different vertices. And I'm basically just going to use the G shortcut on your keyboard to move around the vertices in vertex mode. Just keep that in mind. And once I'm happy with the actual position of the vertices, I'm going to extrude it out to give it some thickness that you've seen before, and maybe add a little bit more detail by adding like a little trim towards the bottom there. A lot of these techniques is nothing new really. You've seen me do this before with the head. I'm just applying this to the body now, making the front chest piece. What's going to be really handy for you is using Shift-Z to go into wireframe mode. Wireframe mode allows you to see the model you've made, to see the vertices or the edges, depending on what mode you're in, without seeing sort of the filled state. And it helps you see through the mesh to see underlying vertices or the things behind, so you know exactly what you're selecting. So you get that by using Shift-Z on, at least in my setting. Now, all I'm doing is extending the torso. I'm working on like the lower torso. So basically like your belly button down to your just like basically your crotch area. And I'm building out what the armor plates look like there. I remember when I was making this character, I really wanted the armor to sort of be layered, but also kind of have a flow to it, because this guy is supposed to be like Prince Tyrion or the Phoenix King. And so it was really important for him to have really beautiful armor that harkened back to like the beautiful shape of a phoenix or a bird, or just like the natural beauty in the world, nature, right? And in birds in general. So that's what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to make sure that the pieces sort of like collapse and connect together really nicely. Once I'm happy with that, essentially I'm going to just reuse some assets, right? I'm reusing that bottom torso piece and putting it to his left side, technically, to act as to start making a bit of a skirt, right? To make thigh armor. I don't know what that's called, but it's essentially like plates of armor that protect your side leg, your side upper leg. And I'm using some old meshes I've made before to do that. And so that's what you see me doing here. Next up, what you see me doing is once I've made the actual armor plates, I kind of took inspiration from Jon Snow and the Starks from Game of Thrones. I've been watching that lately, actually, with the House of Dragon, getting back into this. So I like watching fantasy stuff while I make fantasy characters. It's kind of fun. Anyway, I took inspiration from Jon Snow, and I noticed that what they do is they have metal armor sitting on top of leather padded armor, right? And so that's what you see me doing here. Once I've made the metal plates that protect the front chest, the lower abdomen, and then sort of the side hip area, I start making this plane that is going to act as almost like padding or like chainmail that's going to sit underneath this thick armor. So once that's positioned as a plane correctly, at some point I'm going to extrude it out to give it the thickness that I like, so that when I 3D print it, it's easier for the printer to understand where the filament should go. Now what you see me doing is just doing a little bit of fixing up the mesh a little bit. I noticed that some vertices were overlapping, or some areas of the mesh weren't connected, there were holes in some areas. And so what you see me doing there is basically just double checking to make sure everything's connected and I don't have any non-manifold meshes. When I say non-manifold meshes, what I mean by that is any mesh that has an open face, essentially. Open faces are problematic for 3D printers because they don't really know what to do with that. So as much as possible, when you're making a character model that you intend to 3D print at some point, you want to make sure that it is a non-manifold or is a manifold mesh. It is completely sealed such that if you fill it up with water, no water will leak out. So once I've done that maintenance tweaking, I'm just adding a little bit more detail here. I like to add a little bit more trim to differentiate what is metal armor versus what is going to be the sort of leather chainmail aspect. Now you see me applying a subdivision modifier to really give it the detail and smooth out the mesh. If you like the low poly look, if you like the few faces, there's a lot of benefits to that, right? Especially when it comes to animating, it makes rendering a lot faster. And if you like that look, I'd suggest you don't really need to do the subdivision surface stuff. I personally like it when it's smoothed out, especially when I'm going to 3D print, which is why I use it so often. Now what you see me doing is just adding a little trim around the skirt. Essentially, I guess it's kind of like a chainmail skirt, to polish it off, right? Give it a little finish so that it's not just sort of this open plane. Any place where you can take a piece of armor and finish it with trim is going to help you make your model look a lot more polished and just professional ultimately. And now that I'm happy with the chest plate, the abdomen, and sort of the hip armor, and the placement of the skirt, the leather skirt, what you see me doing is taking a feather from the head model and using that feather as a motif that I'm going to use throughout the rest of the mesh. And these feathers will now act as chainmail for the skirt. And it was really important for me to make sure that I had references to other aspects of the armor throughout the whole thing, right? So this feather is going to be my main motif that I use to tie in the different elements. So the sword, the helmet, the pauldrons, the arms, all that sort of stuff. I mainly use this feather mesh as the main motif to accomplish that and to make this piece look cohesive and tied in and as if it has a particular theme. And I highly suggest that when you think about your character models or when you do this, think about a single element, a simple element that you can use as a motif that you can repeat, maybe in slightly different ways, that helps tie in different areas of your mesh. I think it really makes it look polished and professional when you do things like that. So most of this next part you're going to watch is me just duplicating the feather and positioning it in a way that makes it look kind of like a alternating brick style chainmail armor. So it's just going to be that for quite a while here, as I'm just making sure that it follows a bit of a pattern. It sort of it alternates in the gaps to make it look kind of like purposeful, right? It's not just sort of one row of feathers, they sort of are slightly offset, and it gives it that nice kind of brick layering effect. Yeah, so that's just what I'm going to be doing for a while. While I'm doing that, maybe I'll tell you a little bit more about the Phoenix King, Prince Tyrion. He is supposed to be... Tyrion himself is actually not the first Phoenix King. Apparently, there was a character named Aenarion who was supposed to be the original, right? And this guy, Aenarion, was like the High Elf King. He became the first Phoenix King because he was the one High Elf who managed to sort of free his people from chaos. The chaos is supposed to be kind of like a faction in the Warhammer Fantasy universe. It's kind of like, think you're like demons and your devils and those type of creatures, those generally evil kind of creatures. Anyway, Aenarion was the one who freed his people from them, and unfortunately he had to sort of take on an incredible curse in exchange for power to do that, and that curse sort of continued itself through his bloodline. So in Warhammer Quest 95, this particular character is called Lord Aenarion because he hails from that first Phoenix King who made the deal to gain the power to protect his people. And I thought that was super cool, Prince Tyrion is just sort of like, not the recent, but he is, I think, the current. People describe him as being the reincarnation of Aenarion himself because of how valorous and, how chivalric he is. And I believe he's managed to sort of deny the Curse of Cain, which is the curse that is propagated through Aenarion's bloodline. The Curse of Cain is basically like, I believe there is this legendary weapon that manifests itself in different ways throughout the universe, but it is a tribute to the god Cain, which I believe is like the god of murder and mayhem and carnage and violence. So when you take on the weapon, and in this case for Aenarion it appeared as a sword, when you take it on, you are then cursed by Cain going forward in exchange for this incredibly powerful weapon that is able to sort of defeat crazy like chaos demons. So at some point I do get to design my own version of that. I imagined the Sword of Cain is sort of like this flaming great sword that sort of has I believe it's a Flamberg. Flamberg have those like wavy swords in East Asian cultures. In the Philippines particularly, there's one called the Kali, I believe, the Kali or the Kali, which is a sort of a wavy sword dagger. And I wanted to sort of use that as inspiration to create the Sword of Cain. But we'll do that next, because right now I'm just finishing up all of the chainmail, the chainmail skirt that he has here. You'll notice that I'm doing all of this only on one half of the character, because again, I'm going to use the mirror modifier, and I'm going to mirror around that circle object in the back in order to perfectly replicate it to the other side. So, I don't need to do it twice if I do it that way, and also I can make sure that it looks perfectly symmetrical on both sides. Here what I'm doing is, because I'm reusing a mesh, I want to make sure it's a little bit different, like tweak some of the geometry a bit, tweak some of the angles. And you notice that I add a little indent around the area, around like the mid-thigh area. I think tiny little details like that are enough to distinguish one mesh from another without you having to recreate them. And I'm always a fan of anything that helps save some time, and save some modeling effort wherever you can, because this is a pretty long, intensive process, or it can be if you get really into it. So anything that buys you a little bit of time is always a good thing in my opinion. Yeah, what you see me doing now is just pretty much just tweaking a lot of the meshes. I'm starting to apply the mirror modifiers, or not the mirror modifier, sorry, the subdivision modifiers. And what you see me doing is using the bevel tool. So when I'm in edge mode and I select a particular edge, I can hit Control B to enter bevel state. And if I use my scroll wheel,
I can select how many beveled edges I want to add, and if I move my mouse, I can increase the size of the beveling. So these beveling techniques are really great for hard surface modeling that has a subdivision surface on it. When you apply subdivision, right, you add a bunch of faces and you smooth out the mesh, but what ends up happening is that you start rounding out sharp lines and sort of sharp corners, and maybe that's not the effect you want. So if that's the case, then I suggest using the bevel in order to bring back that sharp line in the areas that you want. Because basically what it does is it takes the distance between the two edges that you added and then adds a bunch of faces, but because the distance is so short, it looks as if it's like a sharp line. And this is, for me, I use this technique all the time when it comes to hard surface modeling and making armor in particular, so I highly recommend. Yeah, so it looks like I got most of the torso done. I've gotten most of the upper and lower leg, basically like the torso and the abdomen done, as well as the upper thigh and the skirt area. So that looks great. And I think I'm going to be moving on next to just making sure that it looks as if each of the pieces, like the front breastplate, is connected to the back plate, I guess what it is. Because when you think about like medieval style fantasy armor, most of the time it's kind of like it sort of opens kind of like a V formation. It opens like a box. And so I want to make sure that I represent where like the harnesses would be for this breastplate and its back plate as well. Now what you're watching is, because I thought this guy as like a prince and a king, I wanted to make sure his armor was very ornate and intricate. And this is one example of a time where I'm just sort of making it up as I go and end up scrapping what I created because I don't think it fits the overall vibe and aesthetic. So what you see me doing here is trying to add a little bit of filigree and sort of like some like armor details, like armor ornamentation, right? Maybe it's like a sigil or something, or like a symbol or like a rune on his chestplate. But no matter how hard I tried, I guess I could have given it a little more effort or time, but it just didn't really fit this particular character and the style that I was going for. So ultimately, I believe I decided to just scrap it and go a different route here. And yeah, so now instead of going with that filigree, what I'm going to do is, like I said before, taking a motif I've used in other places and replicating it throughout the mesh. Sort of not all over the place, right? But be a little strategic with it, but like in key areas. So when it comes to a character model, for me at least, I really wanted to make sure I had a unique element on his forehead, on the helmet, particularly that giant phoenix with the giant plume and the big jewel on it. That was really important. I wanted to make sure I had beautiful feathers and wings to represent the phoenix. And so, basically I'm going to be replicating those elements throughout the rest of the body and the rest of the body armor. Now, all you see me doing is finishing up the back plate there, adding basically a plate that is going to sit on top of the cape when I add it. Just to give it some polish, just so that it's not just an open face there. Now what you see me doing is creating another. Now what you see me doing is taking a plane or a cube and using that cube to basically box model a back plate armor. So I have the sort of upper shoulders chest plate, or not chest plate, but upper shoulders plate armor there, and I have the lower butt kind of area. Now I just need one for the back, the actual back. So I just took a box model, applied a mirror modifier, and moved the vertices around to sort of fit the underlying reference body. And that's where the reference body comes in really handy, right? When I have a reference body there, I can make sure that my armor pieces sit relatively sensible to where I would expect the body to be, right? At some point I might delete this reference body or like replace it with like a cleaner mesh, but this is really great for boxing out your proportions. And like I said before, when you're character modeling, you want to start rough. You want to start with like a general shape and general idea, and then start layering the details after that, right? Don't try and get too detailed immediately. Like don't try and get Don't try and make a super detailed, amazing hand before you've even made the rest of the body's proportions. So that's all I'm trying to say here as my personal tip to you, and what's really helped me be successful when it comes to character modeling. Make a reference body, use that reference body to rough out where each armor piece or just each piece of the character will be, and then add in the detail after that. Now what you see me doing is making the gauntlet. So I'm taking a little box and I am basically just fitting the box to the proportions of the hand that I think look good. This time I'm not really using a mirror modifier, by the way, actually. So that's kind of interesting to know. I'm basically just using edge loops around a single box and moving the edge loops that I'm curious about into positions and into the shape that I like. Also, I will often use the scale modifier to sort of center scale down edges. And so I highly recommend doing that. Play around with the scale and the position tools when you have a chance, because it's really helpful. And here's an example of what I was talking about there, using motifs from other places in the mesh to tie in other aspects. So I added that little circle there because I knew what I wanted to do was add like this feather, almost like a feather, like tassel, or not tassel, but like this flare out element to the end of the gauntlet, because I thought that'd be a really cool way to tie in the wings on the helmet to the rest of the body armor. So that's what you see me doing here. I add a little circle to imply the connection point for this wing, and then I just duplicated the wing I created for the helmet, scaled it down, and maybe moved a couple of feathers into different positions, and then placed it where I wanted it to be. And it sort of makes kind of like an elbow guard, ultimately. And I think it makes a really beautiful shape when it comes to this guy's gauntlet. You'll see that I also layer two of them to make them a little bit more distinct versus the actual helmet wing. And following that kind of technique, I now duplicated the head of the phoenix, and I decided I wanted to replicate the phoenix head on the chest plate and then put the plume of the jewel right behind it, right? So again, using motifs and tying in those motifs in other aspects of your character design to really make this mesh feel cohesive. Now all you see me doing is making sort of like the hand, and so I'm making like the part of the gauntlet where your hand would emerge, but I wanted to add like a little plate to just make it look a little more polished and sort of hide the edge of the gauntlet that is not necessarily like the cleanest. It's just sort of a flat edge. So using this mesh as like almost like a wrist plate helps hide some of the parts of the mesh that you don't want people to see when you 3D print or when you animate it. It's just it's kind of, I guess it's kind of like a bit of a cheat doing something like that. Now what you see me doing is making the actual elbow armor. You see me making what I'm making is like the elbow guard to be placed along the joint between the upper arm and the lower arm. I didn't spend too much time here because honestly the plate was going to be, the elbow guard was going to be hidden by the wing filigree or the wing flare. So I didn't spend too much time making that. I just wanted to imply that there was an elbow guard if someone were to look at it or if it did appear in the scene at any point. You'll also notice that I made sure that there was like extrusions down and in. I did that because I knew that when I 3D print this mesh needs to nicely overlap with another mesh in order for the Boolean modifier to work really well. So that's all I was doing. Now what you see me doing is adding some harnesses to the actual chest, or to the gauntlet. And I just do that using a cylinder mesh and then just like modifying it a little bit. Nothing too crazy there, but just to imply where there is a harness for the gauntlet. A few more tweaks on the chest plate armor here, again, positioning the feather and the plume, adding maybe a bit more of this, trim around the bottom of the armor to make it look polished and like layered, right? And also extending it down to make the trim look thicker. Something to keep in mind when you're making these character models for 3D printing is that depending on your printer, depending on the hose size, you might need to make sure your meshes are a little bit thicker so that the filament, you can get the detail that you want, right? If it's too thin, then when you print it, it might not even come out at all. And it might have been sort of, not pointless, but it's frustrating when you make a really detailed mesh and try to 3D print it, but ultimately you can't do anything because it's too detailed. Like you won't even see it because your 3D printer's funnel or hose doesn't even go that thin. So the 3D printer I was using, I knew did about 0.05 millimeters. So when I was making the trim and when I'm making like the feathers and the armor and all the little details, I keep in mind that I can really only work with about 0.05 millimeter detail. Now what you see me doing is, again, the idea of motifs, right? I'm using the feather that I made for the head, and like I did with the skirt, I'm basically positioning it around the upper arm, the bicep arm area, to make kind of like another sort of chainmail, feather chainmail detail around that arm. I decided not to do a pauldron here because I thought that might be too much detail and too much mesh for this particular character model, and it might ultimately take away from the design. So I decided to just make sure that the upper arm itself had a little bit of nice detail and some tie-ins with the rest of the armor, and I'm doing that using this this offset and slightly scaled down feathers and positioning them around the upper arm to make it look like it's following this guy's bicep down. And I know at some point it's going to connect with the gauntlet, so I don't have to worry too much about doing the full arm in chainmail. Yeah, I think it looks pretty good at this point, right? I'm sort of just looking around to see what areas that I've missed. I decided at this point I might do one more third layer that probably won't come out in the animations or in the 3D print, but just to be sure, and just to make sure that it is fully covered, like the underlying reference mesh, the body mesh is fully covered, I add an additional layer there. And yeah, now, like I said before, right, once you roughed out your general shape, you can go ham with adding the little details that you like. This is sometimes my favorite part once I've made the general mesh, is adding the little ornamentation that I really like. And you see me doing that here. I'm using the plume found in the head and also the chest plate and adding it around the wrist gauntlet to, add a little more finish and a little more polish around that particular piece of the armor. And I think it ended up looking really great. I was really happy with how that turned out. Keep in mind that you can decide to print the underlying body if you want to, the reference body, but I believe when I 3D printed this, I deleted the reference body. So I wanted to make sure that there were no gaps or holes. It's just adding a little circle there as a reference for where the hand will go. At some point I do create the actual hand with fingers and everything, but I just want to make sure that once I did create the hand and once I had a sense of how big the palm would be, it wouldn't look too out of place for this particular character. Again, my style is more like chibi or like cutesy. I don't know how else to describe it. More like characterized or stylized, I guess, versus like the more realistic character models you see with like D&D and Hero Forge and all that stuff. So I try to make sure that my proportions feel right. Now I'm adding like a neck armor, some neck trim, because I want to make sure that I can delete the underlying reference body when I 3D print this. And so I just add a little cylinder there and angle it so that it looks like it's sort of like a collar, metal collar for him that protects sort of the vital jugular and stuff like that. So yeah, again, looking around to see where to go next. Just doing a little bit of tweaks. What I'm doing now is looking at where mesh has overlapped, but to the point where it's like appearing on the outer face of the geometry that makes it look weird. So I'm just like positioning those down and making sure that the face I want to see when printed is truly the outer face. There's not like this weird overlap going on anywhere or anything like that. Yeah, now I'm just going to polish off this neck, add the neck collar area. Now add a little bit of trim to make sure it looks nice and it hides the actual like physical neck a little bit. But for the most part, I think I'm like 90% done character mesh. And at this point, when I remember when I was making it, I was really happy with how it was coming out and getting really excited about 3D printing it, even though I wasn't sure how that was going to go. And yeah, there you go. So here I am taking another plane and again applying the mirror modifier so that I only have to do 1/2. And I hid the rest of the body so that I could focus in entirely on the leg. And what I'm making right now is the knee pad, like the knee plate armor. And I'm just making a knee pad that I think looks nice, or is in the nice shape, and it has sort of like that V shape to it. I like that sort of... I always like that kind of shape when it comes to my character models, so I try to mimic that wherever I go, especially when it comes to armor. And once I'm happy with it, I position it where I expect his knee to be, and I scale it up a little bit. Again, I'm not worried about the other left side, or the right side technically, because I know I'm going to mirror modifier. I'm going to use a mirror modifier to duplicate it on the other side again at some point, so I'm not too stressed about that. Now that I'm done with the knee portion of the armor, I'm going to be using that to basically make the calf and the lower leg piece by extruding it out and connecting it at the back. When you turn on clipping and you extrude and force two meshes or two vertices to connect, and you have clipping turned on, they will actually merge into a single mesh and delete any interior faces. And that's a really nice function when you're using the mirror modifier. I highly recommend taking advantage of that whenever you have a chance. And yeah, that's exactly what I did there. So once I was happy with the knee plate armor, I made the calf and the lower leg. Even though most of that is honestly going to be hidden by the skirt and by the overlaying armor pieces, like the thigh and the skirt and the chainmail skirt, I just wanted to make sure that if in the 3D print or in the animation, if it were to appear, it would be polished and it would look finished. So that was all I was trying to do there. Okay, now cool. Now I'm applying a few more mirror subdivision surface modifiers, using the bevel function to sharpen out any edges that I want or like to imply or like sharp points, or like angled, a little more angled than just sort of general sort of organic curvature. And yeah, I believe at this point I'm going to be finishing off the leg armor. I'm adding a little area where I believe the harness should be. Again, for the harness, I'm not even adding any detail when it comes to like buckles or anything of that. I'm just using a cylinder mesh to imply where the buckle will be. And now what you see me doing is using a box mesh to start making the foot. Again, I'm not even using a mirror modifier here. To be honest with you, I probably should, but I just decided to make sure that when I'm making this when I'm making this foot or this shoe, I just select all of the vertices that I care about. That's why I haven't applied any subdivision surface yet, just to make sure I rough out the right shape. And now to give that shoe a little bit of finish, I duplicate some of the armor pieces, the other leg armor pieces, and add it as kind of like a toe cap. And I think that makes it end up looking very polished, as if it is actually a metal pauldron, or not pauldron, I guess it's like a metal boot armor piece. And yeah, overall I'm pretty much happy at this point. I'm editing the underlying mesh to make the legs feel a little thicker, so that when I 3D print, the thighs don't look disproportionate to the rest of the leg. But for the most part, it's just adding a little bit more detail now. Checking to make sure that all of the harnesses are in the right place, checking to make sure that I don't have any weird overlapping of geometry that could give me a problem in 3D printing. I'm also making sure that all of the armor pieces that I made is properly rotated and properly angled based on what I think how this guy's natural T-pose would be. I'm also going around and starting to apply subdivision surfaces all over the place and beveling where I feel appropriate to, again, make sure that if you're going to apply the subdivision surface modifier, you might want to make sure you apply it to all of your pieces, because like if some are subdivided and others are like low poly, It might end up looking weird. Maybe you're doing that on purpose. Like maybe you only need low poly on certain aspects that are probably hidden for the most part. But just to add a little layer of polish, I make sure that all of the meshes I'm using are subdivided and smoothed out with some bevels to give it that sharp, hard surface model look to it. And that's what you see me doing here. I'm cleaning up the leg, the boot armor, and I think it's ending up looking really nice. For the foot here, I'm just basically adding a few bevels around the base of the foot to sharpen out where like the bed of the foot will sit, and also where the shoe connects to the ankle. And yeah, looking pretty good so far. At the moment, we got the head done, we got the torso done, the abdomen, upper thigh, lower leg, foot, hands, gauntlets, and upper arm, all complete. I believe what I do is make sure I organize all of my mesh so that they are in collections that are sensible. Make sure that when you're character modeling, all of your stuff is well organized. And now finally, I think the last thing I'm going to be doing, or one of the last things I'm doing, is adding a little bit more detail. I felt that the feather plumes and the phoenix head weren't enough motifs to really give it sort of variety and the detail that I wanted. So I'm just adding some stars in a couple of sections, particularly in the gauntlet where I added the original feather flare or the wing flare to guard the elbow. I'm adding these little star elements to just add a little more, just any more detail is always good. And I'm hoping to find other places where I can apply this motif throughout the mesh. But at this point, I'm in like editing mode. I'm in like polishing mode by applying subdivision surfaces and adding bevels to the correct places to make it sharp. Because I want to make sure that this whole mesh as a single piece looks cohesive. Yeah, like what I said earlier, now that I've made this star mesh and I added it to the arm, I want to sort of repeat that mesh in other places so that it feels cohesive. And even if I slightly modify it, I think that's fine. And that's what I'm doing in this case. I'm taking that star mesh I made for the gauntlet and I'm adding it to his helmet, right? To give that gem, that red jewel, a little more beautiful detail. And here I decided to actually add eyes. So most of my character models before were like faceless. And mainly that was because I didn't know how to make a face and I was scared to like try. But I said, screw it, I'm just gonna like try and make an eye based on like anime kind of style. I know that an eye generally has an eyelid, an iris, and then like an eyebrow. And those are sort of the main elements that make an eye. So I'm just trying to do that here using some basic cube box modeling. I'm not even like using any mirror modifiers. I'm just applying a subdivision to make it look natural. And then I'm just using vertex modifying to shape it out the way I want to do it. And I'm not going to do any beveling here. I'm primarily going to use the subdivision surface to make it look smooth and natural. And then once I'm happy with the general pieces, the eye, the eyelid, and the eyebrow, I'm going to start and try and position it on the actual face and make sure that it actually overlaps the underlying face mesh, so that when I 3D print, they print connected. And yeah, that's all I'm doing, because I remember we're gonna use the mirror modifier to duplicate this onto the other side, so I really only need to focus on one side. Again, the reference here, I'm just making this up, right? I'm not really looking at any pictures or anything like that, so I'm just going off of what I see in anime, how their eye shapes generally are. And I think that works well for my style anyways, because I got that sort of stylized, cutesy, cartoony anime style to my character models that personally I love. I hope you like. Maybe that's why you're watching this. And yeah, I think adding that eye really helped polish off the face mesh there. At some point, I think what I'm going to do is get into actual sculpting so that I can learn how to sculpt the nose and the mouth and everything like that. But adding an eye for now, I think is a good win for this character model. Yeah, and now I'm just finishing up with a little bit more detail. I felt like this back skirt here, this back chainmail feather skirt, didn't have a nice sort of trim or finish around the back edge. So instead of modifying the original mesh, because I had already applied a subdivision surface modifier, I'm just adding a cube, and I'm going to modify this cube using mirror modifiers and just like changing the vertices to give it a little bit of point and a little more natural curve. I thought that would have been easier than trying to actually modify like the hundreds of faces that would probably exist on this leather skirt piece. So just sort of overlapped it where I would expect the trim to be, and then using the vertex positioning tool and scale stuff to place it where I want it. Because it's on the back, I'm not too stressed out about that. And yeah. Now I'm adding just rivets along the armor pieces, to make it look like it's somehow connected to each other. Again, I'm trying to add detail because I think a lot about like some other creators, like Grimdark Cuteness and like just your Warhammer Games Workshop characters. They're so detailed, right? And I want to emulate something like that. So I'm trying to add just little not fixations, but fixings here and there to really polish it off and make it look good and be happy with the final product. Ultimately, when I 3D printed this, I was really proud of myself. I thought this was the first character model I ever 3D printed, and I was really happy with how it turned out. I was really pleased with the final result, and I can't wait to get it 3D printed in resin and use it in my Warhammer Quest 95 games, use it in some of my D&D games. That's why I'm sharing it with all y'all in case you want to use it as well, and that's why I'm talking about how I made it in case you want to learn how to do that too. Yeah, there's nothing really much left to talk about here at this point. It's really just tweaking the details, just finessing some parts of finessing it, adding bevels where it needs to be, subdivision surface modifiers, tweaking the helmet a little bit. I guess this is a little bit interesting. I felt like the back of the helmet here was lacking in some detail. Like it looked like I put all the effort in the front, but nothing really in the back of the helmet. So I just wanted to run some trim along the back edge leading up into the neck, just to add a little bit more visual interest to this helmet, because the helmet really is the primary piece of this character model. Like the helmet is what really draws your eye, and it's probably the largest portion. When I think about proportions, this helmet is like larger than the whole body, if I think about it, and I kind of love that. I think it fits my cartoony, characterized style. So I just want to make sure it looks really good. Now what you're seeing is I'm going back in, and because I know that I'm going to delete the underlying body mesh when I 3D print this, I want to make sure that there are no gaps in the character model, like everything's overlapping such that I can delete the underlying mesh without it looking like when I 3D print it, there's like a giant hole somewhere, like under the armpit or something like that. So that's all I was doing there. And I might suggest you do the same exercise when you make your character models. And just make sure you don't have any holes or gaps in the ultimate model. You're going to be using the Boolean modifier to connect all this and make sure that there's no internal faces. So maybe I'll make a video on that later at some point. But yeah, we're basically there. We have the body, the head, and the foot made. Like we've basically made this person. All we need to do now is duplicate it to the other side and we're good. So maybe I'll make a video. The next video I think we'll polish off by doing that and maybe make the sword, and maybe we'll get into texture painting and maybe some animation. So thanks for sticking around. I hope this was useful. Drop any comments down below if you have any questions or if you have any suggestions on how I can improve. Hopefully this was useful to you. I'll talk to you later. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks for watching the video. If you like my content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Let me know down below what you want to see next, or just check out some of these other great videos. Thanks for tuning in. I'll talk to you later.